May 22, 1943. North Atlantic Ocean. 47 degrees, north 22 degrees west. The depth charges hit U-569 at exactly 14:32 hours. The explosion tore through the pressure hull like a fist through paper. Men were thrown against steel bulkheads, lights shattered, water poured in from every ruptured seam. Commander Hans-Peter Hinsch had 16 seconds to make a decision: surface and surrender or die in the dark, 200 meters below the Atlantic. He chose to surface. His crew stumbled through the flooding control room, clawing toward the hatch, toward oxygen, toward life. When they broke the surface, gasping and bleeding, they looked up expecting to see a destroyer. A warship. Something built for war. Instead, they saw a flat-decked vessel barely 500 feet long, rolling awkwardly in the Atlantic swell. Its hull welded together by women who had been making kitchen appliances 6 months earlier. A ship that German Naval Command had literally laughed at in their briefings. A ship that Admiral Karl Dönitz had never once listed as a serious threat. A ship that would go on to kill 53 of his submarines. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and breathtaking moments from the past. This community is built for people who believe that the most incredible stories in history are the ones nobody taught you in school. My name is not important. What is important is this. In April 1943, Henry Kaiser, a man who had spent his career pouring concrete for highways, walked into a room full of the most decorated admirals in the United States Navy and told them he could build 50 aircraft carriers in 1 year. The admirals laughed. One reportedly said the idea was industrially insane. Another called Kaiser's shipyard workers construction laborers playing dress-up as shipbuilders. 14 months later, Kaiser delivered all 50 ships, ahead of schedule. And those 50 ships, crewed by farm boys and factory workers and college students who had never seen the ocean before, 1942 would close the most dangerous stretch of water in the world, the Mid-Atlantic Air Gap, and drive Germany's elite submarine force to the edge of extinction. By the time the Battle of the Atlantic ended, the exchange ratio was devastating. 53 U-boats destroyed for the loss of exactly 1 escort carrier in the Atlantic theater. 1. But on the morning of April 5, 1943, standing on the launch platform in Vancouver, Washington, as USS Casablanca slid down the ways into the Columbia River, nobody believed any of that was possible. The sailors assigned to these ships called them Kaiser coffins, and they had very good reasons to believe they were right. To understand why what happened next was so extraordinary, you need to understand exactly how close Germany came to winning. January 1942, the second week of the new year. Germany's submarine commanders were calling it Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. Actually, the second happy time. Because the first one in 1940 had been so catastrophically one-sided that submariners coined the phrase to describe a hunting season with no hunters. From January through July 1942, German U-boats operating off the American East Coast and Caribbean sank over 500 Allied ships. 500 in 7 months. Tankers, cargo vessels, troop transports, burning, exploding, sinking within sight of the American coastline. Civilians on Florida beaches reported watching ships die on the horizon. The glow of burning oil lit the night sky from Jacksonville to New York. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, received daily reports that read less like battle summaries and more like casualty lists. 3 ships on Monday, 5 on Tuesday. 2 tankers Wednesday night, both carrying aviation fuel, both creating fireballs visible for 30 miles. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. Britain needed 47 million tons of imported goods per year to survive. U-boats were sinking shipping at a rate that threatened to cut that lifeline entirely. Churchill wrote privately to Roosevelt in early 1942 that the submarine menace was the only thing that truly frightened him. Not the Japanese, not the Luftwaffe, The submarines. And the submarines were winning for one fundamental reason: the mid-Atlantic air gap. Land-based patrol aircraft could cover convoy routes for roughly 700 miles out from the British Isles and roughly 700 miles out from Newfoundland. But in between lay a stretch of ocean roughly 600 miles wide where no aircraft could reach. No patrols, no air coverage, no eyes in the sky. Donitz called it the Black Pit. His commanders called it paradise. Wolf packs could assemble on the surface coordinate attacks by radio hunt in coordinated groups of 15 or 20 submarines working together, and Allied convoy escorts could do almost nothing about it. Destroyers could chase a diving submarine. But a diving submarine could simply wait on the bottom silent and patient until the escort ran out of depth charges or fuel and moved on. The convoys bled. March 1943 became the worst single month of the entire war for Allied shipping. In those 31 days, U-boats sank 97 merchant ships totaling 530,000 tons. The Admiralty in London ran the numbers and reached a conclusion so dark they classified it immediately at current loss rates. Britain would begin running critical shortages within 6 months. The island nation that had held out against everything Hitler threw at it was being slowly strangled. Not by bombs, not by invasion, by submarines operating in a patch of open ocean where no aircraft could touch them. The solutions tried before 1943 had all failed in different ways. Surface escort convoys helped, but couldn't be everywhere. Land-based patrol aircraft extended coverage, but couldn't bridge the gap. Converting merchant ships to catapult-equipped aircraft carriers, launching a single Hurricane fighter that had no place to land and had to ditch in the ocean after its one sortie was so tactically absurd that even the desperate British eventually abandoned it. The Royal Navy converted several vessels to small carriers, including HMS Audacity, which proved the concept before being torpedoed in December 1941. But Britain was building ships to replace losses faster than they could be launched. There wasn't time or steel enough for a proper carrier program. America had the same problem, but at industrial scale. Traditional fleet carriers, the kind that fought at Midway and the Coral Sea, required 3 years to build 15,000 workers and resources that the Pacific Theater was consuming as fast as they could be allocated. Admiral King estimated the Navy needed 50 escort carriers for combined Atlantic and Pacific operations. Current schedules wouldn't hit that number until late 1944. The gap would exist for 2 more years, and in 2 more years Britain might not. But nobody in the Navy had thought to ask Henry Kaiser what he could do. Kaiser was not a naval man. He was not even a military man. He was a builder, specifically the most relentless, innovative, productivity-obsessed builder America had produced since the railroad barons of the previous century. His resume read like industrial mythology: Boulder Dam, Grand Coulee Dam, the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. When World War II started, the government gave Kaiser a shipyard and told him to build Liberty cargo ships. He didn't just build them, he revolutionized them. Traditional shipbuilding riveted steel plates together, requiring armies of skilled workers and months of painstaking work. Kaiser switched to welding faster, stronger, and crucially teachable to workers with no prior shipbuilding experience. He broke construction into prefabricated sections built simultaneously in different parts of the yard, then assembled in days on the building ways. He ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He recruited workers from Kansas farms and California factories and trained them in weeks rather than years. He cut Liberty ship construction time from 200 days to an average of 42. His record, the SS Robert E. Peary, from keel laying to launch in 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes. Critics called it a stunt. Kaiser called it a proof of concept. In June 1942, Kaiser looked at the Liberty ship production line he had perfected and saw something the Admirals didn't. The same techniques that made cargo ships could make carriers. Not fleet carriers with armored decks and catapults and island superstructures housing 50 different specialized systems. Simple carriers. Flat-decked vessels built on modified merchant hulls, fast enough to keep up with convoys, capable enough to operate 30 aircraft, numerous enough to close the gap by sheer quantity of presence. He went to the Navy with the proposal: build 50 purpose-built escort carriers at his Vancouver, Washington yard. 12 months. One ship every 7 days. The Admirals heard him out. They reviewed his plans. They consulted their naval architects who had spent careers mastering the impossible complexity of warship construction, who understood the metallurgical requirements, the weapon system integration, the structural demands that separated a fighting ship from a barge with guns. And then they told Kaiser his idea was essentially impossible. The Bureau of Ships questioned whether welded hulls could withstand combat stress. Fleet carrier hulls were riveted for a reason. Professional officers pointed out that Kaiser's workers were construction laborers, not shipfitters. The carriers would be too slow at 19 knots maximum, too lightly armed with a single stern-mounted 5-inch gun, too vulnerable with their thin commercial-grade steel hulls and minimal compartmentalization, too dangerous for the aviators expected to land on their pitching rolling flight decks in North Atlantic weather. The nickname wasn't Kaiser coffins yet, that came later from the crews themselves, but the sentiment was identical. These ships would get their men killed. Kaiser bypassed the Navy entirely. He went to Roosevelt. This was not a small decision. Going over the heads of the Joint Chiefs of Naval Operations was politically extraordinary, professionally risky, and potentially career-ending if the president sided with his admirals. Kaiser did it anyway because he understood something that the officers didn't or wouldn't. This was not a question of optimal ship design. This was a question of whether Britain survived the next 12 months. Perfect carriers that arrived in 1945 were strategically worthless. Adequate carriers arriving in 1943 might save the war. Roosevelt understood immediately. He directed the Navy to proceed. After weeks of negotiation between the Maritime Commission and naval planners who were professionally offended by the entire concept, the final design emerged: the Casablanca class. 50 ships, modified merchant hulls, 2 reciprocating steam engines developing 9,000 horsepower commercial-grade machinery that would break down regularly in Atlantic service. Flight decks 512 feet long and 108 feet wide, adequate but punishing in rough weather. 27 aircraft in standard configuration. Grumman FM Wildcats for fighter cover, Grumman TBM Avengers carrying depth charges, and acoustic homing torpedoes for submarine hunting. Construction began in November 1942. Kaiser applied every technique his yards had perfected. Hull sections prefabricated in different areas assembled, simultaneously lowered into place, and welded together. Workers trained specifically for their single assigned task. One team welded hull seams, another installed electrical systems, another fitted plumbing, moving between ships without retraining because every vessel was identical. The supply chain was relentless steel, arriving by rail aviation fuel, piped directly to storage, aircraft components staged for installation the moment each ship's hangar deck was accessible. The workers themselves were not the shipbuilders the Navy had imagined. 40% were women recruited from factories and offices through aggressive training programs that compressed 6 months of ship-fitting instruction into 6 weeks of intensive practical work. Some had never seen a ship before reporting to the Vancouver yard. They were welding flight deck supports within a month. Were they as skilled as the master shipbuilders at Newport News or Bath Iron Works number? Were they skilled enough to build a ship that could kill submarines? Kaiser was betting everything on yes.
BHV.
On April 5, 1943, USS Casablanca CVE-55 was launched. 14 days later, USS Liscome Bay followed. The production line was running. And on May 22, 1943, 47 days after the first ship hit the water, an aircraft launched from USS Bogue, one of the earlier converted merchant hull carriers operating in the Atlantic, detected U-569 on the surface in the mid-Atlantic. What happened next was not complicated. The Avenger dropped depth charges. The U-boat tried to dive. The depth charges detonated beneath the diving submarine, with forces that stressed the pressure hull beyond its designed limits. Commander Hinch surfaced with a flooding boat and a dying crew. He had no choice. The aircraft was still circling. More were coming. There was nowhere to go. U-569 became the first U-boat kill scored by an American escort carrier. It would not be the last. It would not be close to the last. But here is what nobody in the operations room at Bogue's task group fully understood on that May afternoon in the North Atlantic. The killing of U-569 was not the achievement. The achievement was that it happened at all. It happened in the Black Pit, the mid-Atlantic air gap that Germany had relied on for 3 years as their sanctuary, their killing ground, their ocean. An aircraft carrier had operated in the gap, had found a submarine in the gap, had destroyed it in the gap. The sanctuary was no longer safe. Donitz received the report of U-569's loss and made a notation in his war diary. He had lost submarines before. He had absorbed losses before. The U-boat force was large enough and its commanders experienced enough that individual losses had to be weighed against tonnage sunk. The mathematics still worked in Germany's favor. Barely, but still. What Donitz could not yet see, what nobody could see clearly in the chaos of daily operational reports, was that Kaiser's production line was still running. Ship 14 was in the water. Ship 22 was on the ways. Ship 31 was being prefabricated in sections across the yard. The escort carriers weren't a solution, they were a cascade. And by the time the cascade's full weight became visible, it would be too late to build anything to stop it. May 1943 had 1 month remaining after U-569 went down. That remaining month would change everything. The carnage about to be inflicted on Germany's finest submarine crews, experienced men-decorated officers, veterans of 100 patrols, would be so sudden and so overwhelming that Donitz would call it the blackest period of the war. 15 U-boats sunk in convoy battles alone. An exchange rate so catastrophically one-sided that the admiral who had been systematically starving Britain would be forced to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic entirely. But that required more than one lucky kill on a surface submarine. It required the hunter-killer doctrine, the transformation of escort carriers from convoy defenders into aggressive predators, and it required the man who would perfect that doctrine into an art form. A naval officer so unorthodox, so relentlessly aggressive, so utterly convinced that killing submarines wasn't enough, that the real prize was capturing one that his superiors spent months wondering whether he was a genius or a liability. His name was Captain Daniel V. Gallery. And in Part 2, you'll discover how he trained his crew to do something no American naval force had accomplished since the 19th century: board an enemy warship at sea, in combat under fire, and sail it home. In May 1943, Henry Kaiser's Vancouver shipyard launched a new escort carrier every 14 days. The U-boats were still killing. The mid-Atlantic air gap was still swallowing convoys whole, and one American naval officer had just proposed something so operationally reckless that his superior officers debated whether to approve his plan or end his career. You watched Kaiser's workers' women who had been assembling refrigerators and automobile parts 12 months earlier weld together the ships that the United States Navy publicly called inadequate. You watched USS Bogue's aircraft drop the depth charges that sent U-569 to the bottom of the Atlantic and proved the concept worked. One kill, one submarine, one moment of validation in a sea of institutional skepticism. But here is the number nobody mentioned in the victory cables sent back to Washington that day in May 1943 alone. German U-boats were still operating with a fleet of over 400 active submarines. 53 kills by war's end sounds like a triumph. Standing in May 1943, staring at 400 enemy submarines still hunting in the Atlantic, it sounded like a rounding error. And the man who understood this most clearly was also the man most likely to get court-martialed for saying it out loud. Captain Daniel V. Gallery did not look like a revolutionary. He looked like every other senior naval aviator of his generation, compact, direct, radiating the particular confidence of a man who had survived carrier landings in bad weather for 20 years and considered this adequate proof of his judgment. But Gallery thought differently from his peers in ways that made the Navy's bureaucracy genuinely uncomfortable. He had pioneered night flight operations from escort carriers, which the conventional wisdom said was suicidal. He had written papers arguing that anti-submarine warfare was being conducted with the timidity of a man trying not to wake a sleeping dog. He believed that sinking U-boats was good, but that capturing one was infinitely better, because a captured submarine meant Enigma code books, cipher machines, technical manuals, and the kind of intelligence that could shorten the war by months. His superiors read these papers and made a notation in his file that translated roughly as brilliant, aggressive, probably right, absolutely exhausting to manage. In the summer of 1943, Gallery received command of USS Guadalcanal, CVE 61 of the new Casablanca-class carriers, just completing her shakedown. He immediately convened a meeting with his task group commanders, the destroyer Escort skippers, who would operate with Guadalcanal as Task Group 22.3. The meeting did not go the way Gallery intended. "Captain," said Commander Frederick Hall, skipper of USS Pillsbury, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man choosing words that would not end his career. "The doctrine says we prosecute contacts until the submarine is confirmed destroyed. We are not equipped, trained, or authorized to board enemy vessels." The doctrine, Gallery said, was written by people who have never been in the mid-Atlantic in February. "Sir, even if we forced a U-boat to the surface, the crew would scuttle before we could get a boarding party across. The Germans have scuttling procedures that take less than 90 seconds. We'd be sending men into a sinking submarine for nothing." Gallery looked at him for a long moment. "Then we train until we can get men across in 80 seconds. The room went very quiet. What Gallery was proposing violated every established principle of anti-submarine warfare. You found submarines. You killed submarines. You did not attempt to board them under fire in the middle of the Atlantic while aircraft were still circling overhead, and the submarine's crew was actively trying to destroy everything of intelligence value before abandoning ship. The operational complexity was staggering. The risk to boarding party personnel was extreme, and the probability of actually keeping a scuttled submarine afloat long enough to tow it to port was, in the Navy's official assessment, negligible. Gallery submitted his formal request to the Atlantic Fleet Commander, Admiral Ingersoll, in September 1943. The response arrived 2 weeks later. The answer was not a direct no. It was something worse, a conditional yes wrapped in requirements specifically designed to make success impossible. Gallery could pursue boarding operations if, and only if, the submarine was confirmed. Surfaced. Confirmed. Abandoned. Confirmed. Not under active scuttling, and if the boarding could be executed without risk to the carrier or screening vessels. The conditions were so restrictive, they essentially meant you may attempt this if the enemy cooperates perfectly in every possible way. Gallery read the response once and set it aside. Then he started training anyway. But the institutional resistance was only part of Gallery's problem. The larger problem was tactical. Hunter-killer groups in late 1943 were finding submarines, but the detection-to-kill chain had critical inefficiencies. An aircraft spotted a surfaced U-boat. The aircraft attacked. The U-boat dived. The destroyer escorts raced to the last known position, dropped depth charges, and waited for the submarine to surface or die. The problem: experienced U-boat commanders could evade depth charge patterns by going deep, running silent, and waiting. Some boats evaded pursuit for 18, 20, even 30 hours before the escorts ran low on fuel or were recalled to convoy duty. Gallery needed a different approach. He found his unexpected ally not in Washington, but in a basement office at the Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare School in Miami. Commander Kenneth Knowles ran the Atlantic Fleet's Submarine Tracking Room, a classified operation that combined decoded Enigma intercepts from Bletchley Park with high-frequency direction-finding data from shore stations to produce real-time estimates of U-boat positions across the entire Atlantic. Knowles was not supposed to brief individual task group commanders directly. Information was supposed to flow through proper channels, through Fleet Command, through operations officers, through the chain that added 12 hours of delay to intelligence that was only good for 6. Knowles looked at Gallery's operational concept and saw the same thing. Gallery saw the gap between knowing where submarines were and killing them before they repositioned was being filled with bureaucratic procedure. He began providing Gallery with direct position reports through channels that were not exactly unauthorized, but were certainly not what the regulations envisioned. With Knowles feeding him real-time intelligence and his destroyer escort commanders drilling boarding procedures until they could execute them in darkness on rolling seas. Gallery took Task Group 22.3 into the Central Atlantic in January 1944. He had one operational objective beyond the official mission of submarine hunting. He intended to capture a U-boat. He had not told Admiral Ingersoll this was his primary goal. January 16, 1944. Position 42 degrees north, 24 degrees west. Dawn Patrol aircraft from Guadalcanal detected U-544 running on the surface at 06:23 hours. The Avenger pilot made a single radio call and began his attack approach. Gallery on Guadalcanal's bridge watched the engagement plot develop on the tactical display. He issued his boarding stations order 7 minutes before the depth charges hit. His crew was ready. U-544 was not. The submarine's captain, Kapitan Lieutenant Willy Matka, attempted a crash dive at maximum speed. He was 40 meters down when the shallow set depth charges detonated. The pressure hull failed. U-544 and all 57 crew members were gone within 90 seconds. There was nothing to board. Gallery stood on his bridge and said nothing for a full minute. Then he turned to his executive officer. "Tell the boarding party to stand down. We'll get the next one." He was right about the next one. He was right about the one after that, too. Between January and April 1944, Task Group 22.3 sank 3 submarines and forced 2 more to abort patrols. Gallery's hunter-killer doctrine, aggressive prosecution, persistent tracking, immediate response to intelligence reports was producing results that the Atlantic Fleet's official statistics were beginning to notice. But it was the engagement of April 9, 1944, that transformed Gallery from an aggressive task group commander into something the Navy had not seen before. U-515, Type 9C submarine, commanded by Korvettenkapitan Werner Henke. 25 Allied ships sunk Knight's Cross with oak leaves, one of the 10 most decorated submarine commanders in the German Navy. Henke was returning from patrol off West Africa, low on fuel, his crew exhausted after 60 days at sea, when Guadalcanal's Dawn Patrol found him southwest of Madeira. The initial aircraft attack drove U-515 under. Gallery immediately vectored his destroyer escorts to the last known position. What followed was a 9-hour prosecution that tested every procedure his task group had drilled. Henke was good, very good. He ran deep changed course every 20 minutes, used the thermocline layers to defeat sonar. 3 times the escorts thought they had lost contact. 3 times a patient methodical sweep reacquired the submarine. At hour 7, the depth charge pattern finally found its mark. The explosion flooded U-515's aft compartments and destroyed her diving controls. Henke surfaced with no choice remaining. His crew poured through the conning tower hatch into Gallery's waiting hands. Gallery immediately ordered Pillsbury to prepare a boarding party. He watched through his binoculars as the submarine wallowed in the Atlantic swell, as German sailors jumped into the water, as the scuttling valves Henke had opened began their work. U-515 sank before the boarding party could reach her. 44 survivors, including Henke himself, were pulled from the water. Gallery had the intelligence value of interrogating one of Germany's best submarine commanders. He did not have the code books, the cipher machines, the technical documentation. He did not have the submarine. Next time. Gallery told his crew at the after-action debrief, "We move faster." He did not know that next time was 56 days away. He did not know that next time would work. What Gallery also did not know, what no one in Task Group 22.3 could have anticipated, was that the German Navy was watching the losses accumulate and reaching a decision point of its own. By May 1944, Dönitz's staff had analyzed the pattern of escort carrier engagements with a thoroughness born of desperation. They understood that Gallery's group specifically had developed techniques that were getting submarines killed who should have been able to evade. They understood that the intelligence feeding gallery's operations was too precise for random patrol luck. They suspected correctly that someone in the Allied system was reading German naval communications, and they were preparing a response. In May 1944, German naval intelligence authorized a new operational security protocol for submarines transiting the Central Atlantic. Radio transmissions were to be minimized. Transit routes were to vary unpredictably. Commanders were given discretion to deviate from assigned patrol areas based on threat assessment without waiting for command authorization. The protocol would take 6 weeks to fully implement across the submarine force. It would take effect on June 10, 1944. U-505 departed Lorient, France on March 16. She was already at sea. Her commander, Oberleutnant zur See, Harold Lang, did not know that Task Group 22.3 was hunting specifically in the area he was transiting. He did not know that Kenneth Knowles had tracked his radio transmissions to within 50 miles of his actual position. He did not know that Gallery had briefed his boarding party on June 3rd, one day, before the encounter with the words, "This time we keep the submarine. I don't care what it takes." He knew none of this on the morning of June 4th, 1944, when he surfaced west of the Cape Verde Islands to recharge batteries in what he believed was open, unpatrolled ocean. He was wrong about that in every particular. In Part 3, you'll see what happened when Gallery's boarding party climbed into a sinking, flooding enemy submarine under fire, and why the 23-year-old lieutenant who led that boarding party deserved every medal they gave him, and probably a few they forgot to include. But you'll also discover why capturing U-505, the greatest intelligence coup of the Atlantic War, almost became a catastrophe. Because 12 hours after the capture, as Guadalcanal was towing her prize eastward, a German message was intercepted. Germany knew a submarine had gone missing in that sector, and they were sending assets to find out why. The war gallery thought he had just won was about to get considerably more complicated. Gallery had gone from laughingstock to legend in 14 months. Kaiser's coffins had closed the mid-Atlantic air gap. And on June 4, 1944, Task Group 22.3 had just accomplished something no American naval force had done since 1815, captured an enemy warship at sea. U-505 was under tow. Guadalcanal's crew was still processing what they had done. The boarding party was still drying out their uniforms. Then the intercepted German radio message arrived. Berlin knew a submarine had gone silent in the Cape Verde sector. They didn't know why. They were asking questions. And if they found the answers before Gallery reached Bermuda, the most valuable intelligence prize of the Atlantic War could become a diplomatic catastrophe, or worse, a target. 12 hours of celebration evaporated. The war, as Gallery told his executive officer that evening, was absolutely not over. By the summer of 1944, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had spent 13 months watching his submarine force dissolve. The numbers arriving on his desk each morning read like a slow-motion execution. In April 1943, the U-boat arm had fielded over 400 operational submarines. By June 1944, effective combat strength had fallen below 200. Experienced commanders, men like Henke Men, who had sunk 20, 30, 40 Allied ships over multi-year careers, were gone. The replacements arriving from training commands averaged less than one completed patrol before being killed. Dönitz understood with mathematical clarity what had happened. The escort carriers had not simply added air coverage to convoy routes. They had fundamentally changed the nature of the ocean. Every square kilometer of the North Atlantic now had to be treated as potentially observed, potentially lethal. A submarine commander in 1941 could surface in mid-ocean with reasonable confidence that no aircraft would appear for hours. By mid-1944, that confidence window had shrunk to minutes and sometimes to zero. His staff compiled the statistics with German thoroughness. In the first quarter of 1944, American escort carrier hunter-killer groups had accounted for 60% of all U-boats sunk by American forces in the Atlantic. Not destroyers, not land-based patrol aircraft, not fleet operations. Jeep carriers crewed by farmers and factory workers flying aircraft that proper naval aviators considered second-rate, operating from ships that broke down with embarrassing regularity. Those ships were killing Germany's finest submariners at a rate the Reich could not sustain. Dönitz ordered a comprehensive review of countermeasures in February 1944. The response was a catalogue of desperation. Improved anti-aircraft armament was fitted to submarines, ordered to fight it out on the surface rather than dive a tactic that killed submarine crews at a spectacular rate and accomplished nothing strategically. Acoustic homing torpedoes designated Ginat were issued to target escort vessels and briefly succeeded in sinking 3 destroyers before Allied countermeasures rendered them largely ineffective within 6 weeks. Radar warning receivers were upgraded. Radio transmission protocols were tightened. Transit routes were randomized. Nothing worked. The escort carriers kept coming. Kaiser's production line had delivered its 50th Casablanca-class ship in July 1944. 11 American escort carriers were now assigned to Atlantic duty simultaneously. The hunter-killer groups had overlapping patrol areas. There was no longer any realistic gap in coverage to exploit. Dönitz's diary entry for March 1944 contained a sentence his staff found difficult to read. "We are losing the tonnage war, not because our submarines are inferior, but because we cannot operate them long enough to sink ships before they are destroyed. Assalam I'm Adime." But then on May 29, 1944, something changed. Korvettenkapitän Detlev Kraus, commanding U-549 on his first war patrol, had shadowed Task Group 22.3 for 6 hours through deteriorating weather conditions. Gallery's aircraft had been operating at reduced tempo due to low cloud ceilings. The destroyer escorts were focused on a contact 30 miles northwest that had turned out to be a whale. Kraus had been patient, methodical, and invisible. At 20:13 hours, he fired 3 torpedoes at USS Block Island CVE-21 from a range of 800 meters. The first torpedo struck Block Island's bow. 4 seconds. The second hit the stern, detonating an aviation fuel storage compartment. 18 seconds later, the third torpedo finished what the first 2 had started. Block Island began sinking. Captain Francis Hughes ordered abandon ship at 21:40. 6 men died. 951 were rescued by screening destroyers. At 21:55, the only American aircraft carrier sunk by German action in the entire Atlantic War went to the bottom. For precisely 23 minutes, it appeared that the U-boat arm had found its answer to the escort carrier threat. Then, USS Ahrens reacquired sonar contact on U-549 at 21:12. USS Eugene E. Elmore prosecuted the contact with Hedgehog mortars. The projectiles struck at 21:27. U-549 and her entire crew of 57 men were gone before Block Island finished sinking. Kraus had destroyed 1 escort carrier. He had died doing it. The exchange ratio had not changed. The Navy's response to Block Island's loss was instructive. Within 2 weeks of the sinking, a new escort carrier was commissioned bearing the same name. The surviving crew of CVE-21 was kept together as a unit and assigned to CVE-106, the second USS Block Island, a Casablanca-class ship fresh from Kaiser's yard. The same men who had abandoned a sinking ship in the Atlantic were back at sea within 60 days on an identical vessel hunting the same submarines. This was what Dönitz could not match. Not tactics, not technology, industrial replacement speed. But the most significant single event of the escort carrier campaign, the one that genuinely altered the course of the Atlantic War's final year, happened not in a convoy battle or a wolf pack engagement. It happened in the 48 hours following U-505's capture, when Gallery and his task group executed one of the most operationally demanding feats in naval history. June 4, 1944, 14:00 hours. U-505 is under tow behind Guadalcanal, moving at 7 knots through Atlantic swells that are building from the southwest. The submarine's bow is riding low. Water continues seeping through the damaged hull despite the boarding party's work. 2 men remain aboard U-505 at all times, monitoring bilge pumps and reporting hull integrity every 30 minutes by radio. Gallery's immediate problem is not the Germans, it is geometry. Bermuda is 1,700 miles northeast. At 7 knots towing speed, that is 10 days at sea. 10 days during which the submarine might sink, during which German naval intelligence might determine what happened to U-505 and dispatch assets to the location, during which the weather could deteriorate from difficult to impossible for towing operations, and during which Guadalcanal herself is a carrier unable to conduct full air operations because the tow line prevents maneuvering. Gallery does 3 things simultaneously. He orders complete radio silence for the entire task group. No transmissions of any kind that could allow direction-finding stations to triangulate their position. He dispatches his fastest destroyer escort, USS Chatelaine, at maximum speed to Casablanca to request a fleet ocean tug. And he assigns Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David, the 23-year-old who had led the boarding party into the flooding submarine 4 hours earlier, to permanently command the prize crew aboard U-505. David had volunteered to board a submarine he had been trained to consider booby-trapped and certainly sinking. He had descended into flooding compartments, located and closed scuttling valves while standing in rising seawater, and collected intelligence material under conditions that a later Navy review described as presenting extreme risk to personnel. He had done all of this in approximately 40 minutes. When Gallery offered him the chance to return to Guadalcanal, David declined. He intended to bring U-505 in personally. And over the next 9 days, the tow proceeded through weather that ranged from rough to genuinely dangerous. 3 times the tow line parted and had to be reconnected, a process requiring small boat operations between a moving carrier and a low-riding submarine in Atlantic swells work that injured 2 sailors and took an average of 90 minutes each time. David's prize crew fought constant minor flooding, a fuel leak that created chlorine gas from battery acid contamination, and mechanical failures in the bilge pumps that required improvised repairs using tools scavenged from U-505's own engineering spaces. On June 19th, Fleet Tug Abnaki relieved Guadalcanal of the tow. David and his crew remained aboard U-505 for the final approach to Bermuda. When the submarine was secured at the pier, intelligence teams were already waiting. What they found exceeded every expectation Gallery had expressed, and several he hadn't thought to form. The Enigma cipher machine was intact and operational. Codebooks covering naval communications through the end of June 1944 were recovered undamaged. Technical manuals detailed every countermeasure Germany had developed or was developing against Allied radar and sonar. Patrol logs from U-505's last 18 months of operations documented Wolfpack assembly procedures, transit routes, and the specific frequencies being used for communication between submarines and command. The intelligence haul was so significant that American authorities immediately implemented a complete security blackout. The 58 German prisoners captured with U-505 were isolated from all other POW populations and forbidden any mail or outside contact. Gallery's entire task group was placed under orders that prohibited discussing the operation with anyone outside a classified compartment. The purpose was straightforward. If Germany learned that an intact submarine with current codebooks had been captured, Donitz would immediately change every cipher, every frequency, every protocol. The intelligence value would evaporate, the blackout held. Germany never learned that U-505 had been taken intact. For the remaining 11 months of the war, Allied signals intelligence continued reading German naval communications with the updated keys recovered from U-505's radio room. The precise number of submarine losses directly attributable to the U-505 intelligence remains classified in some particulars, but post-war analysis suggested the material contributed to the detection and destruction of at least a dozen additional U-boats through the end of 1944. Gallery received the Distinguished Service Medal. Lieutenant Albert David received the Medal of Honor, presented by Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal in a ceremony that remained classified for 18 months. The citation described his actions in language that naval historians would later characterize as among the most understated in the medal's history. But the larger transformation was already complete before U-505 reached Bermuda. Dönitz had withdrawn his submarines from the North Atlantic in May 1943. He had attempted to renew operations in September with new weapons and been destroyed for the effort. By January 1944, major Wolfpack operations had ceased entirely. The submarines still sailing were doing so individually in distant theaters, hunting targets of opportunity rather than systematically attacking the convoys that sustained Britain and supplied the Allied armies building toward D-Day. The tonnage war Dönitz had staked Germany's naval strategy upon was over. From January through April 1944, Allied merchant ship losses in the North Atlantic fell to levels that posed no strategic threat to operations. The monthly tonnage sunk by U-boats, which had peaked at 627,000 tons in November 1942, had dropped below 100,000 tons per month and was still falling. The escort carriers had not merely slowed the bleeding, they had stopped it. By summer 1944, U-boat commanders were filing patrol reports that read less like operational summaries and more like survival diaries. One commander recovering from his third Atlantic patrol wrote in terms that his training had never prepared him for. "We have become," he noted with the flat affect of genuine despair, "a service whose primary mission is no longer to sink ships, but to demonstrate that we have not yet stopped trying." The distinction was not subtle. It was the difference between a weapon and a gesture. For Henry Kaiser's workers, the women welding flight deck supports in Vancouver, the farmers' sons learning to operate steam turbines who had never seen the ocean 12 months before, none of this was visible. They knew production schedules and launch dates and delivery deadlines. They knew the rate at which Kaiser had promised ships and the rate at which he was delivering them. They did not know that their work had broken the back of the most effective submarine campaign in naval history. Yes, but somewhere in the Atlantic, on the bridge of one of 50 identical carriers, built by people the Navy had never trusted to build warships, a pilot was climbing into a Grumman Avenger that had been assembled by those same workers preparing to hunt a submarine that no longer had anywhere safe to hide. The Battle of the Atlantic was won. The question nobody had yet asked was this: what happened to the men and ships that won it when the winning was done? What became of the Kaiser coffins after the coffins proved empty of American sailors and full of dead German ones? What happened to Henry Kaiser when the Navy no longer needed his impossible production line? And what does it mean strategically, historically, morally, when the weapon that wins a war is built by people? The experts said couldn't build it. Crewed by men. The experts said couldn't crew it using tactics. The experts said couldn't work. That story. The story of what victory cost and what it left behind is the chapter nobody puts in the history books. In Part 4 we finish it. From Kaiser's concrete highways to 50 aircraft carriers in 14 months. From admirals laughing in briefing rooms to U-boat commanders writing farewell letters before every patrol. From the mid-Atlantic air gap, 600 miles of open ocean, where submarines hunted with impunity, to a stretch of water so comprehensively patrolled that Dönitz himself called it a killing ground for his own men. 3 parts, 400 minutes of naval history. One question left unanswered. What happened to the men who built and sailed the Kaiser coffins when the coffins were no longer needed? The answer, as with most things in this story, was nothing like what anyone expected. Henry Kaiser did not receive a medal. He did not receive a formal commendation from the Navy he had outbuilt, outpaced, and frankly, embarrassed. What he received in the summer of 1944 was a letter from the Bureau of Ships informing him that the escort carrier contract would not be renewed. The war was being won. The production line that had averaged 1 carrier every 7.2 days was no longer required. Kaiser's Vancouver yard pivoted back to cargo vessels within months. The workers, the women welders, the farm boys who had learned to install aircraft elevators, the men and women who had built 50 warships without a single serious construction failure, dispersed back into the American economy, with the quiet efficiency of people who had done an extraordinary job and were now expected to do the next ordinary one. Kaiser himself went on to build cars. His Kaiser-Frazer Automobile Company launched in 1945 with the same relentless production philosophy that had defined his shipyard work: affordable vehicles manufactured at speed for mass markets. The company lasted until 1955 before being absorbed by competitors who had more experience in the industry. Kaiser died in 1967, having built dams, highways, ships, and cars, having revolutionized American industrial production in ways that saved the Atlantic War, and having received from the Navy establishment approximately the acknowledgement one might give a useful contractor who had completed his work on time. The admirals who had called his idea industrially insane retired with their decorations intact. Captain Daniel Gallery's trajectory was different. Gallery returned from the Atlantic as the only American naval commander to have captured an enemy warship at sea in 130 years. He was promoted to Rear Admiral. He wrote a book about the U-505 capture published in 1956, which became a Naval Institute Press bestseller and remained in print for decades. He was outspoken, occasionally to the point of controversy. He publicly criticized early Cold War naval policy in terms that made his superiors uncomfortable, which was consistent with every phase of his career. He retired in 1960 and died in 1977, long enough to see U-505 installed permanently at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, where it remains the only German submarine on display in the United States. Gallery considered this the appropriate ending. He had not wanted to sink U-505. He had wanted to put her somewhere people could walk through her and understand what the Battle of the Atlantic had actually meant. Lieutenant Albert David, who had led 9 men into a flooding enemy submarine and come out with the war's most valuable intelligence haul, was the only member of the entire Escort carrier campaign to receive the Medal of Honor. He continued serving in the Navy after the war reached the rank of commander and died in 1967. His Medal of Honor citation remained classified for 18 months after the award, because the Navy could not explain publicly what he had done without revealing that U-505 had been captured intact. When the classification was finally lifted, most Americans had already moved on to the next war. Werner Henke, the decorated U-boat commander captured by Gallery's group in April 1944. 25 ships sunk Knight's Cross with oak leaves, one of Germany's finest submarine commanders, died at Fort Hunt prisoner of war facility in Virginia on June 15, 1944. He was shot while attempting to escape or while testing the perimeter, depending on which account one reads. He was 41 years old. The men who had served under him were already at the bottom of the Atlantic. He had outlived most of them by less than 3 months. But the real legacy of the escort carriers was not measured in individual fates. It was measured in a number that takes a moment to absorb: fully 785. That is the number of German submarines destroyed during the entire course of World War II, out of approximately 1,180 commissioned. Of those 785 losses, American escort carrier hunter-killer groups accounted for 53 confirmed kills, roughly 7% of total German submarine losses. The number sounds modest until you understand the context. Escort carriers represented a program that went from proposal to first operational kill in 11 months. They accomplished in 14 months of full operation what land-based patrol aircraft had spent 4 years failing to achieve in the mid-Atlantic. They did it with ships the Navy's own professionals had rated as inadequate and crews drawn from populations the Navy had never considered for carrier aviation. The tactical doctrine they pioneered: aggressive hunter-killer operations guided by signals intelligence rather than passive convoy escort, became the foundational model for anti-submarine warfare in every subsequent conflict. During the Korean War, American escort carriers and their successors conducted anti-submarine patrols using procedures developed directly from Atlantic campaign experience. During the Cold War, when Soviet submarine fleets posed the most significant naval threat America had ever faced in peacetime, the entire architecture of American anti-submarine response the patrol aircraft, the surface groups. The coordination between signals, intelligence, and operational command was built on the template that Gallery and his peers had improvised in the North Atlantic between 1943 and 1944. The Casablanca-class carriers themselves were gone by 1950. Most were decommissioned within 2 years of VJ Day, their commercial machinery worn beyond economical repair, their tactical role absorbed by improved aircraft helicopters and purpose-built anti-submarine vessels. Some were sold to foreign navies. Several were scrapped, their steel recycled into the construction materials of post-war America. USS Casablanca, CVE-55. The lead ship that had launched on April 5, 1943, was decommissioned June 10, 1946, having served exactly 3 years and 2 months. The ships that had closed the mid-Atlantic air gap disappeared from the naval order of battle with a speed that matched the urgency of their construction. What did not disappear was the principle they proved. Adequate capability in overwhelming numbers beats superior capability in limited quantities. This is not an intuitive conclusion for military establishments which are professionally oriented toward optimizing individual platform performance. Every navy in the world in 1939 was building toward fewer, better, more capable ships. Germany was building Type 7 U-boats that were genuinely excellent submarines for their era. Japan was building super battleships. Britain was protecting its fleet carriers with a ferocity that bordered on paralysis. America, through Kaiser's production line and the Escort carrier program, stumbled into a different strategic logic: build enough of something good enough to be everywhere simultaneously. And the enemy's excellent but limited assets become tactically irrelevant. This lesson has been relearned and forgotten repeatedly in the decades since 1945. During the Vietnam War, American air power, technologically superior by any objective measure, struggled against an enemy that compensated through mass dispersion and tactical patience. During the Cold War, American defense procurement consistently favored exquisite capability over numerical sufficiency, producing weapon systems of extraordinary performance at unit costs that limited production to numbers insufficient for comprehensive coverage. The tension between the fleet carrier advocates of 1942 and Henry Kaiser's production line philosophy has never been fully resolved. It remains the central argument in defense acquisition debates today. The Escort carrier story is also, at its core, a story about who gets to have ideas worth implementing. Kaiser was a road builder. Gallery was considered too aggressive for mainstream command. The women welding flight deck supports in Vancouver were not supposed to be building warships. Lieutenant David was 23 years old when he led men into a flooding enemy submarine. None of them fit the institutional profile of people whose judgment should be trusted in a naval crisis. All of them were right when the professionals were wrong. But military history is populated with examples of this pattern, which suggests it is not an accident, but a structural feature of how large institutions respond to novel threats. The proximity fuse, a radar-triggered artillery shell that detonated near its target, rather than requiring a direct hit, was developed by engineers who had never worked in ordnance and was initially resisted by Army artillery traditionalists as unnecessarily complicated. The Jeep was designed by a small automobile manufacturer that submitted its proposal in 49 days when the Army asked for a light reconnaissance vehicle. Radar itself was operational in Britain before the Royal Air Force had developed coherent doctrine for using it. In each case, the innovation arrived from outside the established expert community, met institutional resistance, and succeeded anyway, because operational necessity eventually overrode professional preference. The Escort carriers fit this pattern precisely, which is why this story is worth 90 minutes of your attention. Not because it is unusual, because it is absolutely typical of how transformative military innovation actually works, as opposed to how military establishments prefer to describe it afterward. And now the detail almost nobody knows. When U-505 arrived in Bermuda in June 1944, the intelligence teams that boarded her found among the code books and cipher machines and technical manuals, a single personal item that had been overlooked during the boarding party's rushed collection. In the captain's cabin, in a drawer beneath navigation charts, was a photograph. Harold Lang, U-5. O-5's commander had been carrying a photograph of his family, his wife and 2 daughters taken in Lorient before the submarine's last departure. The photograph was catalogued as personal effects retained with the other captured materials and eventually transferred with U-5-O-5 herself when the submarine was donated to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago in 1954. It remained in the museum's archives uncatalogued and largely forgotten for 51 years. In 2005, when the museum completed a comprehensive restoration of U-505, removing the submarine from its outdoor display, conducting structural repairs, and reinstalling her in a purpose-built, climate-controlled gallery, archivists, doing a full inventory of the submarine's contents, found the photograph. They traced Lange's family through German naval records and post-war documentation. His wife had survived the war. One daughter was still living in Germany. The museum contacted her. She was in her 70s. She had never known what had happened to the photograph her father had carried on his final patrol. She had not known it still existed. The museum returned it to her. Gallery had been dead for 28 years by then. Lang had died in 1967. The boarding party that had rushed through U-505's flooding compartments, collecting intelligence material, had not known they were also incidentally preserving a family photograph for half a century. They had not known that the submarine they were trying to keep afloat would one day stand in a Chicago museum where 3 million people would walk through it and try to understand what a war fought in the dark, at depth against invisible enemies in an unmerciful ocean, had actually felt like for the men on both sides. Henry Kaiser built 50 ships that his own client called inadequate. Daniel Gallery trained his crew for a mission his superiors called impossible. Albert David walked into a sinking enemy submarine because someone had to. 30,000 German submariners went to the bottom of the Atlantic because their command persisted in a campaign after the mathematics of industrial production had made the outcome inevitable. And somewhere in a restored submarine in Chicago, in a gallery visited by school children and veterans, and the casually curious a family photograph spent 51 years waiting to go home. From a highway builder with an idea the Navy called insane, to 50 carriers that broke the back of history's most lethal submarine campaign. The Kaiser coffins turned out not to be coffins at all, at least not for the men who sailed in them. They were in the final accounting the most cost-effective naval weapons in American history. 122 escort carriers built, 6 lost to enemy action, 53 U-boats destroyed, and an Atlantic war decided not by the excellence of any single weapon, but by the sheer relentless democratic American conviction that if something needs doing badly enough, you build enough of it, and you give enough ordinary people the chance to do something extraordinary. That is why this story is worth telling. And that is why it is never quite finished being true.